On July 23, 2025, at some point in the morning, Trey Parker and Matt Stone signed a contract with Paramount worth $1.5 billion. 10 hours later, at 10 o'clock at night, the first new episode of South Park in more than 2 years aired on Comedy Central. Inside that episode, they attacked Paramount directly. They named the lawsuit Paramount had just settled with the President of the United States. They put the real face of Donald Trump onto a cartoon body walking naked through a desert. The White House issued a formal statement condemning the show within 24 hours. The woman who owned Paramount had personally approved the episode without watching it. That is one season. There are 26 other seasons of this show, and every single one of them has a story buried inside it that the audience was never meant to know. Welcome to East Park. Let us get started. The pilot that nearly killed the show before anyone saw it. Before any of this existed, before the merch and the movies and the billion-dollar deals, there were two broke film school friends with a shoebox full of construction paper and no contract. That is the first thing to understand about South Park. It did not arrive on television the way most shows arrive on television. It crawled there. It got built by hand in a small room by two people who were not sure anyone was ever going to pay them for it. And the thing you are about to learn, the thing that feels almost impossible now that this show is the longest running animated series in American cable history, is that the pilot of South Park came extremely close to being the last episode of South Park. The show you know started life as a short called The Spirit of Christmas. There were actually two of them. Trey Parker and Matt Stone made the first one in 1992 when they were students at the University of Colorado Boulder. It was rough. It was crude. It was the two of them and some paper and a camera and a lot of swearing. The second one came in 1995, made for a Fox executive named Brian Graydon, who paid them about $2,000 to produce it as a video Christmas card he could send to his friends. That tape is the thing that changed everything. Graydon mailed it out, those friends made copies, those copies got mailed to more friends, the copies became copies of copies. By the middle of 1996, that short was one of the first things in history to go viral, except the internet was not fast enough yet to carry video. So it spread on VHS tapes, passed hand to hand through offices in Hollywood. Comedy Central found out about it. They were a small cable channel at the time, not the brand it would become, and they were looking for something that would actually get people to notice them. They called Parker and Stone in for a meeting. They agreed to make a pilot. And this is where the first buried fact of the show's history sits, the one most people do not know. When Parker and Stone started making that pilot, they did not have a contract for a series yet. Comedy Central had not agreed to pick up the show. They had only agreed to pay for the pilot and then decide. So when the two of them sat down to make Cartman Gets an Anal Probe, they were making it with the full understanding that there was a real chance nobody would ever see it, and that whatever work they put in could very easily be thrown away. Because they had no guarantee of more money, they had to build the whole thing on the cheap. They did not have the budget for proper animation. They had no studio behind them doing the slow work that normal cartoons need. The kind of work that in those days usually got sent to a team in South Korea and took months to finish. So Parker and Stone did the only thing they could afford to do. They built the entire pilot by cutting out little pieces of construction paper and moving them frame by frame with their hands, the same way they had made the two Christmas shorts. That is why the pilot looks the way it looks, and why it does not quite match any episode that came after it. It is the only episode of the entire series ever made by actual paper cutouts. Every single episode since then has been put together on a computer, just made to look like paper. The pilot took 3 months to finish. 3 months of two people in a small room moving tiny pieces of paper, and when they were done, they realized something awful. They had made the episode too long. The final version ran about 28 minutes. Nobody had told them, and they had not thought about it, that a half-hour block on cable television is not actually half an hour. It is closer to 22 minutes because the rest of the block has to be commercials. So Parker and Stone had to sit there and chop 6 minutes of their own work out of the pilot and then rebuild another 3 minutes of new story on top of it to make the cut version still make sense. In the first version they animated, Cartman shoots fire out of his backside because some older kids had fed him hot peppers. That is what the scene was originally about. In the cut-down version, the same thing happens, but now the reason is the alien probe. They rewrote the reason for one of the most famous moments in the pilot after the fact because they had run out of minutes. Some of the material they cut was not thrown away. A whole scene involving the character Pip got pulled from the pilot and reused almost a full year later in the show's 5th episode, still in the original paper cutout style, which is why that one scene looks different from everything else around it. Even the people who have watched the first season many times do not always catch that. It is a small small piece of the pilot that survived inside a different episode. Now here's the part that gets darker, and it is the real secret of season 1. Before the pilot ever aired, Comedy Central showed it to test audiences. Test audiences are groups of normal people the network pays to come watch a show and fill out forms about whether they liked it. And the test audiences hated it. They hated it so much that the network came very close to walking away from the whole thing. The reaction was especially bad among women. The women who watched the pilot did not just dislike it, they were, by the network's own measure, deeply upset by it. The foul language, the violence against a baby, the crudeness of the animation itself, all of it came together into something the testers did not want to watch and did not want anyone else to watch either. If this had happened a few years earlier or a few years later, the show would almost certainly have been killed right there. The only thing that saved it was something neither the network nor Parker and Stone had fully planned on. The second Spirit of Christmas short was still spreading on VHS tapes. It was still being copied and passed around, and the people passing it around were getting louder about wanting more. Comedy Central could see that there was a real audience forming for this thing outside of the test room. They took the risk. They ordered 6 episodes. 6. That is all they committed to at the start. If the audience had not shown up once those first 6 aired, the show would have ended inside its first year, and none of the rest of this story would exist. The pilot finally aired on August 13th, 1997 at 10 o'clock at night. And the thing that people forget is that before the episode even went out on Comedy Central, the reviews from critics had already started coming in, and most of them were not kind. A writer for the magazine Time predicted that the show would not last past a single season because it was too crude and not clever enough. Parker has talked about that specific review and commentary for years afterward, because it stuck with him. They were being told in the same week their show was premiering that the thing they had spent years making was going to be dead in months. The actual premiere pulled in a little under 1 million viewers on its first airing. That does not sound like much today. In 1997, on a small cable channel, it was considered a strong number. But what happened next is where the season 1 story gets genuinely strange. The show aired in Canada too, on a network called Global TV, and Global TV was terrified of the material. They cut whole chunks of the pilot before they let it on the air. They removed a joke involving a word that rhymes with dildo. They removed 2 separate scenes of Kyle kicking his baby brother Ike. They showed this edited version in a primetime slot right after the show Seinfeld, which was at that time the biggest show in North America. And then the complaints started. Parents called the station. Parents wrote letters. Parents said they had been sitting down to watch Seinfeld as a family, and their children had stayed in the room for what came after it. Within about 2 months, Global TV moved the show from its primetime slot to midnight and quietly restored all the material they had originally taken out. The Canadian version of the pilot that most people saw first and the Canadian version that aired at midnight from late 1997 onwards are 2 different cuts of the same episode. There are people in Canada who watched Cartman Gets an Anal Probe in 1997 who have never seen the full version at all, because the full version only came later and at a time when they were already asleep. Over in Britain, the show did not even air for a year. The channel that finally picked it up, Channel 4, waited until July of 1998 to broadcast the pilot, and a representative of the station said out loud to the press that the only reason they were airing it was for people coming home drunk from the pub. That is how the show was introduced to the British audience, as something for the drunks. There is one more piece of season 1 that most fans never hear about, and it is the part that sits underneath everything else the show did that first year. When Parker and Stone were making the early episodes of the actual season, after the pilot had been picked up, they were doing it with almost no money and an impossibly short production schedule. Every episode had to be made in about 3 weeks on the computer, compared to the 8 or 9 months that normal animated shows took. They were writing, voicing, and animating almost everything themselves. They had a tiny team. And in those first episodes, the female voices in the show were originally performed by a different actress than the one most people associate with the show. Her name was Carrie Turner. She voiced the women in the first version of the pilot, the test version. But Parker and Stone were not happy with those recordings. Before the pilot aired publicly, they brought in a different actress to redo all of those lines. That actress gave them new ideas, specific choices about how the mother characters should sound, and she ended up recording over all of Turner's work. When you watch Cartman Gets an Anal Probe today, every woman you hear is a second recording. The first recording still technically exists somewhere in an archive, but they have never been released. A whole alternate version of the show's first voices sits in a vault at Comedy Central, and nobody outside the studio has ever heard it. So when you think about season 1 of South Park, think about what it actually was. Two young men in a cheap office cutting out paper with their bare hands, making a show that tested so badly the network almost killed it. A pilot so long they had to hack out whole scenes and rewrite the jokes to cover the holes. A Canadian audience watching a sanitized version that got quietly swapped out after complaints. A British audience kept away from the show for almost a full year. Reviews predicting a quick cancellation, and a whole secret version of the voice acting sitting unheard in a locked archive. None of it was supposed to work. All of the signs said it would not work. The show is now almost 30 years old. That is the uncomfortable truth underneath the very first season of South Park. The show that went on to be the most controversial, most enduring, most legally aggressive animated series in American television history was 6 episodes away from being forgotten in 1997. Everything that happened after, every fight with a religion or a president or a country, every boycott and every bomb threat and every lawsuit only exists because a pilot nobody liked got through a door that was already closing on it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But surviving that first season was only the start, because the moment Parker and Stone realized their audience would actually stay with them, they started testing something much more dangerous, something that nobody inside Comedy Central saw coming and nobody at home was ready for. The prank that ended season 2 did something that the show's own creators would later call the moment they learned how much their own fans could hate them. And what it involved, and the number of complaints it triggered inside a single week, is the next thing we need to talk about. Section 2. The April Fool's prank that broke the fans. By the time season 1 had finished, Comedy Central had something they had not really expected to have. South Park had gone from a show a test audience tried to kill to the highest rated program on basic cable. The pilot pulled in under 1 million viewers in August of 1997. By the end of that same first season, episodes were pulling in numbers that primetime network shows dreamed about, and the network was suddenly in the position of having built its entire identity, almost by accident, around a cartoon it had nearly passed on. Parker and Stone were famous now. Not a little famous, properly famous. Their faces were in magazines. Their show was being talked about on the news, and the network that had been scared to give them a series was now asking for more of everything as fast as they could make it. The final episode of season 1 aired on February 25th, 1998. It was called Cartman's Mom is a Dirty Slut. It is still the single most watched episode in the entire history of South Park, pulling in around 6.4 million viewers on its first airing. That is a number that, for a cable show in 1998, was almost hard to believe. And the episode did something the show had never done before. It ended on a cliffhanger. The mystery of who Cartman's father was had been built up across the whole season, and right as the answer was about to come, the episode stopped. Cartman's mother was hooked up to a DNA machine. The machine was about to print the result. And then, nothing. Cut to black. Come back in a few weeks, and we will tell you. The next episode was scheduled for April 1st, 1998. That was the key detail. The network promoted it heavily. The press wrote about it. Fans talked about it on the early internet forums, which were just starting to be a place where fans of a show could gather and argue with each other. The show put out previews. The network booked commercials. Every single piece of marketing pointed to the same promise. On April 1st, you would find out who Cartman's father was. That is not what happened. What Parker and Stone did instead is something that almost no showrunner in television history has ever done, and nobody has really done it since. And there is a reason for that. They wrote and made a completely different episode. An episode that had nothing to do with the cliffhanger. An episode that did not feature Stan, Kyle, Cartman, or Kenny in any real way at all. Instead, it was a full 22-minute story about two Canadian side characters from earlier in the show, Terrence and Phillip, who were basically just two crude cartoons whose entire job in the original show was to fart at each other and laugh. Parker and Stone made an entire episode of those two characters, called Terrence and Phillip in Not Without My Anus, and they put it on the air on April 1st in the slot where the resolution to the cliffhanger was supposed to go. It was a prank, an April Fool's prank. They had even hidden a small clue inside the season 1 finale because a brief preview for the Terrence and Phillip episode appears on a television screen during the finale itself. A preview the fans at the time noticed and assumed was a joke or a throwaway gag. It was actually a warning. Parker and Stone had been planning the prank for weeks. They just did not tell anyone outside of a very small group at Comedy Central. The reaction inside the first 24 hours was unlike anything the network had ever seen on a cable channel. Comedy Central received more than 2,000 complaint emails about the episode with within a week. 2,000. In 1998, when sending an email still required most people to sit down at a desk, open up a slow program, and actually type out a message to a company, 2,000 emails was a serious number. The network had to put staff on answering them. Some fans did not just complain once, they wrote in multiple times. Some wrote to local newspapers. Some wrote letters on actual paper. The story made the news. A reporter for the New York Daily News wrote a piece called "South Park Fans Aren't Laughing." A reporter for Newsweek wrote about it. This was happening to a cartoon, about a prank. The anger was so intense that Comedy Central, which had planned to space out the rest of the season and let the Terrence and Phillip episode exist as a one-off for about 6 weeks before bringing back the cliffhanger, actually caved to pressure. The resolution episode, called "Cartman's Mom is Still a Dirty Slut," had been originally scheduled to air on May 20th, 1998. The complaints were so many and so loud that the network pushed the episode up by almost a full month. It aired on April 22nd instead. In network terms, that is essentially an emergency rewrite of the entire release schedule because of fan rage. And for a show that had built its whole reputation on not caring what anyone thought, it was a moment where the audience forced a real change. Even that was not the end of it. Years later, media outlets were still reporting on people who had never forgiven Parker and Stone for the prank. A reporter in 2003, 5 years after the event, found fans who still brought it up as the moment they felt lied to by the show. Parker himself has said on the DVD commentaries that they were genuinely shocked by the reaction. They had assumed the fans would find it funny, or at least be able to take the joke. What they learned instead was that the audience that had showed up for their show had showed up with real expectations, and breaking those expectations, even in fun, carried a cost. There is another layer under this whole story that most fans do not know about, and it is where the real production secret of season 2 lives. When Parker and Stone finally aired the resolution episode on April 22nd, they had only about 3 weeks to make it, because they had just spent their previous production window making the Terrence and Phillip prank episode instead. So the payoff to the biggest cliffhanger in the show's history, the episode millions of people had been waiting for, was put together in an impossibly short amount of time. Watch the episode now and some of the pacing feels strange. There are side plots that go nowhere. There is an extended cannibalism joke involving actual cannibalism of a guest-voiced actor, Eric Roberts, because the writers could not figure out what to do with the huge cast they had assembled. And the actual reveal of Cartman's father was, in itself, a kind of cop-out. The answer turned out to be that Cartman's mother was the father, because she was born with both sets of private parts, and that meant the father question was essentially a trick question the audience had been tricked into caring about. Parker has acknowledged on commentary that they came up with that answer because they did not really have a good answer, and they were running out of time. The bigger joke, the one they felt good about, had been the prank itself. The actual resolution was a structure they built around the obligation to give the audience something. More than 12 years later, in 2010, the show would come back and retcon the whole thing in the episode called 201, revealing that the hermaphrodite answer had been a lie made up by the town to cover up the real identity of Cartman's father, who turned out to be Jack Tinnerman. That means that for more than a decade of the show's history, the canonical answer to one of its biggest mysteries was something the writers themselves admitted was a stalling tactic. Season 2 was also the season where something else quietly shifted in the show's writing room, and this is where the secret gets darker in a different way. Parker and Stone started that season under enormous pressure. The network wanted them to hire professional writers. They wanted them to expand the team. They wanted South Park to operate more like a traditional sitcom, with a proper staff of people pitching jokes and writing drafts. Parker and Stone hired a few of those writers. They tried to do it the traditional way, and they hated it. In an interview years later, Parker described looking at scripts from that era and being unable to stand scenes that other people had written. He has said that season 3 is the season he hates the most, and that a big part of the reason is that there are scenes in it written by people who were not him or Matt, and that those scenes felt wrong to him in a way he could not fix. By the end of season 2, they had already started pulling away from the traditional writer's room model, and by season 4, they had essentially abandoned it for good. From that season onward, almost every line of dialogue in the show comes from Parker, Stone, and a very small, trusted circle of collaborators. The show you watch today is still shaped by the lesson they learned in season 2, which was that handing parts of their show to other people broke something they could not put back together. But the part of season 2 that really tells you what was happening inside that writer's room is what you do not see in the finished episodes. Among the many things that got cut out of of season 2 for time and tone, there were several plot lines involving a character named Pip, a British orphan whose role in the show kept getting smaller and smaller as the season went on. He had been a prominent character in season 1. By the end of season 2, he was basically background. Parker and Stone have said in commentary that they simply did not know what to do with him. They had created a character they could not write for, and rather than fix him, they buried him. Pip survived as a background character for years afterward, mostly mute, mostly unused, until he was eventually killed off as a joke in the same season 14 episode that retconned Cartman's father. A character who had been on the cover of press releases for season 1 was gotten rid of in about 4 seconds of screen time. The other cast change that happened quietly during season 2 had to do with the guest voices. The show had a strange habit in that era of asking huge celebrities to be in episodes, and then assigning them ridiculous, non-speaking or barely speaking roles as a joke on the celebrities themselves. Henry Winkler came in to voice a monster whose entire performance was grunts and growls. Jay Leno came in to voice a cat whose entire performance was meows. George Clooney had already voiced a barking dog in season 1. Jerry Seinfeld, at the height of his fame, was offered a role on the show as a turkey named Turkey Number 2 and turned it down. Parker and Stone thought this was funny. The celebrities, most of the time, went along with it because being in South Park had become a kind of status symbol, even if your actual line count was 0. But it was also a way for Parker and Stone to mark their territory. They were making the show on their terms. If a movie star wanted to be in it, the movie star was going to be a farm animal. By the end of season 2, the show had become one of the biggest things in American television. Merchandise was everywhere. T-shirts with Cartman's face were selling out in stores. Plush toys of the characters were on shelves for Christmas. A full-length theatrical movie had already been greenlit and was about to be put into production. And somewhere inside all of that, Parker and Stone were already starting to feel the weight of what they had built. They had gone in 2 years from 2 film school friends making paper cartoons to the most talked about writers in comedy. The machinery they had accidentally created was bigger than they were, and they were about to make decisions that would push them and the woman who voiced almost every female character on their show to a place none of them were ready for. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously, because the next year of production would include a full-length theatrical movie, a live performance at the Oscars, and more screen time for one particular voice actress than any other person in the show's history. She was the one who turned a flat script into something the audience felt. She was the one who gave the mothers of South Park their specific voices. She was, by every measure, the emotional center of the show's sound. And in the middle of the season that followed, while the show was hitting the biggest moment of its cultural life, she was privately fighting a battle that none of her co-workers knew about, and that would end the way nobody saw coming. Section 3. The voice of every woman in South Park, and what happened to her. A note on care before we begin. This section deals with a real person who died by suicide. Her name was Mary Kay Bergman, and she deserves to be spoken about with the weight that any real person deserves. If you are going through something hard yourself, or if this topic is not one you want to sit with right now, this is a fine place to step away for a bit and come back to the rest of the video later. If you have watched South Park at any point in its first 3 seasons, you have heard her. You may not have known it, but you have. The voice of Cartman's mother, the sweet and distant and slightly off Leanne, was her. The voice of Sheila Broflovsky, Kyle's mother, the one who yells what when she gets upset, was her. Wendy Testaberger was her. Sharon Marsh was her. Shelly, Stan's older sister with the lisp and the braces, was her. Kenny's mother was her. The mayor was her. The teacher principal Victoria was her. The list keeps going. Almost every woman you ever heard speak in the first 100 episodes of the show was the same person doing all of them. Her name was Mary Kay Bergman. She was born on June 5th, 1961 in Los Angeles. She was an only child. Her mother had worked in animation herself back in New York City, hand-painting frames for old Popeye cartoons. Mary Kay grew up watching Saturday morning cartoons with her mother and wanting to be in them. She studied acting at a university in Los Angeles for 3 years and then started getting voice work in the late 1980s. By the 1990s, she had become one of the most booked voice actresses in the whole industry. She did over 400 commercials. She voiced Daphne in the Scooby-Doo direct-to-video movies. She voiced Dr. Blight in the cartoon Captain Planet. She voiced the original test recordings for Timmy in the Fairly OddParents. And most importantly, she was the official voice of Snow White for Disney from 1989 onwards. Every Disney park, every Disney commercial, every new Snow White recording from that decade was her. Kids across the world heard her and did not know her name. Here is where her story crosses into South Park. When Parker and Stone were finishing the pilot, they were unhappy with the original female voice work done by Carrie Turner. They held a recasting session. Mary Kay came in. She was already a huge name in the voice acting world, but nobody outside the industry would have recognized her face, and that was exactly how she wanted it. She came into the session and immediately started offering ideas Parker and Stone had not thought of. She suggested that Leanne, Cartman's mother, should sound like a sweet old-fashioned sitcom mother from the 1950s, a soft and cheerful voice that would make every terrible thing she said to her son feel even more wrong. She suggested the what catchphrase for Sheila. She gave Shelley her lisp. She came in and basically designed the sound of the women of South Park in one session. Parker and Stone cast her as almost every female character in the show, not just a few, almost all of them. Over the next 3 years, she would voice more female roles on South Park than any other performer in the show's entire history, before or since. She was also a major voice in the 1999 South Park movie, where she performed 9 different characters, including most of the singing on the song Blame Canada, which would go on to be nominated for an Oscar for Best Original Song. There was just one thing. Mary Kay was doing all of this under a fake name. In the credits of every South Park episode and on the movie poster itself, her name did not appear. Instead, a name she had invented was listed in the female voice actress slot. The name was Shannon Cassidy. She was worried, and her team was worried, that if her real name showed up on a show as crude as South Park, it would get her fired from her Disney job. Disney had hired her to be the voice of Snow White. Snow White is the face of the whole company, the original Disney princess, a character marketed directly at small children. If parents found out that the same voice was also saying the extreme language that came out of Sheila Broflovsky's mouth, Disney would almost certainly let her go. So she hid. She worked on the biggest show on cable television for 3 straight years, and almost nobody knew her real name. Only insiders in the voice acting world knew that Snow White and Cartman's mother were the same woman. This double life was one pressure. There were others. Bergman's mother had been diagnosed with cancer during this period, and watching her mother sick was wearing her down. She was working an enormous amount. South Park alone was a week-by-week production schedule, and on top of it, she was still doing Disney work, commercials, Scooby-Doo movies, and side projects. She had also started suffering from something that was not visible to anyone around her. According to her husband Dino Andrade and later reporting, she had been dealing with generalized anxiety disorder for a long time, and it was getting worse. Her anxiety was causing real physical symptoms. She could not sleep. Her body ached. She was nauseous. She told her husband, privately, that she was afraid of losing her voice, of waking up one day and discovering that she could no longer do the job she had built her whole life around. She hid all of it. She hid it from her family. She hid it from her friends. She hid it from everyone she worked with. Parker, Stone, and the entire South Park crew had absolutely no idea anything was wrong. To them, she was still the same Mary Kay who showed up every week with more ideas for how to make a joke land, who could switch between 6 different character voices in a single recording session without losing her place, who was by all accounts one of the most talented people they had ever been in a room with. By late 1999, South Park was in the middle of its 3rd season. The show was bigger than ever. The movie had come out that summer, the soundtrack was a hit, the Oscar nomination for Blame Canada was a real thing that was happening, and Mary Kay was, in private, falling apart. On the morning of November 11th, 1999, she did a voiceover session for a radio commercial celebrating the 45th anniversary of Disneyland. She recorded the voice of Snow White one more time. Later that day, she was on the phone with a close friend around 9 o'clock at night. About an hour after that phone call ended, her husband came home with a friend of the family and found her. She had taken her own life. She left behind 2 notes. One was for her husband. The other was for a close friend of the couple, John Bell. In that second note, she wrote that she could not handle her fear anymore. She was 38 years old. The news was shared quickly. It was put up on her personal website. It was printed in Variety magazine on November 15th. Parker and Stone were told. They were both, in their own words later, too devastated to speak to the press at first. It took them almost 4 months before they could give a proper public interview about her, which they finally did at the Paley Center for Media in March of 2000. In that interview, they said something that has stuck with the show forever. They said they realized immediately that one person was not going to be able to replace her. Not because the voices themselves were impossible to copy, but because Mary Kay had been bringing something to each character that was specific to her own sense of humor and her own emotional intelligence. They said it was going to take a lot of talented voice people to do what she had been doing alone. The first South Park episode to air after her death was called Starvin' Marvin in Space. It was dedicated to her memory. The last new character she ever recorded was a small role. girl, a girl named Rebecca Cotswolds, in the episode Hooked on Monkey Phonics. That episode aired 3 weeks before she died. The Christmas special that came out at the end of that year, called Mr. Hankey's Christmas Classics, used audio she had already recorded before her death, including her singing on the song Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas. During that final musical number, the animators put together a tribute sequence. As the lyrics passed by with the line, "Faithful friends who are dear to us," clips of every single female character Mary Kay had ever played flashed across the screen, one after another, a living gallery of her work. That Christmas special remains to this day the last episode of South Park to feature her voice in any form in any new material. There is one more detail that sits at the heart of this story, and it is the thing that makes the timing especially cruel. Mary Kay had been scheduled to perform the song Blame Canada at the Oscars ceremony in March of 2000. She had been on the track, she had been the voice of most of the song. She was going to stand on that stage and sing it in front of an audience of hundreds of millions of people. After her death, the Oscar producers gave the performance to Robin Williams instead, and he performed it as a tribute to her. The song lost the Oscar that night to Phil Collins for a Disney song from Tarzan. Parker and Stone were so annoyed about this that years later, they still bring Phil Collins up in their shows as a running joke. Mary Kay is buried at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in the Hollywood Hills. Her grave has engravings of 3 of her South Park characters on it: Leanne Cartman, Sheila Broflovsky, Wendy Testaberger. The characters she invented, the voices she first built in that casting session, they are carved into stone where she rests. Her husband, Dino Andrade, started a memorial fund after her death. It raises money for suicide prevention through a clinic in Los Angeles. It is still operating today. Inside South Park itself, the show had to rebuild. Parker and Stone brought in 2 other voice actresses to split Mary Kay's work. A woman named Eliza Schneider came in first, near the end of season 3. Her first new lines as a South Park voice actress were for Sharon Marsh and Kenny's mother in the episode Are You There, God? It's Me, Jesus. Later, a second actress named Mona Marshall also joined. Between the 2 of them, they slowly took over the roles Mary Kay had built. Schneider stayed for a few years and then left. Marshall stayed longer. A third actress, April Stewart, joined later, and along with Marshall, still voices most of those female characters on the show today. If you go back and listen now, you can hear the seam. The female characters of South Park do not sound quite the same after season 3 as they do during season 3. The voices are close, the performances are solid, but the original warmth and weirdness that Mary Kay brought, the specific way Leanne would say something kind to her son while enabling his worst behavior, never quite came back. It was, in a real sense, lost with her. The show continued, the show got bigger, but the sound of it changed the moment she was gone, and it has never fully changed back. This is the part of South Park history that the show does not talk about very much, and that the fans do not always know. There is a reason the women of South Park sound different before and after season 3. The reason is a person who was carrying more than anyone around her understood, who gave her best work to a show that had no idea she was suffering, and who, in the middle of her industry's biggest year, could not carry it anymore. She made those characters. She died without most of the audience knowing her name, and then the show kept going. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously, because it had to. By the middle of the next year, the writer's room was already deep into producing season 4, and the new season was about to run into something different from Grief. Something public. A single episode from season 4 was about to cross a line so specific that one major country would ban it outright. A national pedophilia group would find themselves named on television by a cartoon, and the subplot buried underneath all of it, involving one character trying to do something to his own unborn sibling, would become one of the single most reported pieces of content in the show's legal history. What that episode was, and what the reaction to it looked like inside the network and outside of it, is where this goes next. Section 4. The episode one country banned and nobody talks about. A note before we go any further. This section covers an episode about people who target children. Nothing graphic will be described, but if that topic is something you would rather not have in your head right now, please feel free to skip ahead to the next section. The full runtime of this video is long enough that missing one part will not break the rest for you. The year is 2000. The new season of South Park has just started. The creators are different people than they were at the start of the show. They have been through the loss of Mary Kay Bergman. They have finished a theatrical movie which required them to work for almost 2 straight years on the same project while still still producing weekly episodes. They are exhausted. They have money now, which they did not have before, but the money has not made the job easier. If anything, it has made the pressure worse, because now every episode they make has to be as good as the movie was, and no show can live up to that kind of expectation week after week. Parker has said on the commentary for season 4 that he hates a lot of the episodes in that period. He has said that he and Matt were not paying enough attention to the show because they were still thinking about the movie, and that the quality of the writing suffered. What he did not say, but what the episode list makes clear, is that they were also trying something new during season 4. They were pushing at topics that most animated shows would not touch, and they were doing it at a pace that did not give them time to second guess themselves. Some of the results worked, some of them did not, and one of them, on June 21st, 2000, crossed a line that no cartoon, before or since, has gone near in the same way. The episode is called Cartman Joins Nambla. It is the 53rd episode of the series overall. It is the 5th episode of season 4, and its setup, on paper, sounds like a joke someone would whisper to a friend and then immediately apologize for. Cartman decides that his 3 best friends are too young for him. He is 9 years old. He wants older friends. He goes onto an internet chat room to find them. The chat room he stumbles into is one that is targeted at men who are attracted to boys. That is the plot. That is what the episode is actually about. What happens next is a full 22 minutes of a cartoon child being groomed by internet predators in almost every scene. The predators in the episode have specific, recognizable tactics. One of them sends Cartman a book and gives him a back rub. Another one messages him online with lines that the show's writers did not invent from nothing. They researched them. They based the dialogue on real chat room patterns that were, at the time of the episode's airing in the year 2000, a genuine threat that parents were only just beginning to understand. This was before most American households had any kind of parental software on their computers. This was before most parents even knew what a chat room was. And a cartoon, aimed at adults but watched by plenty of children, decided to put the subject directly in front of the audience and not flinch. The episode's title refers to a real organization. NAMBLA stands for the North American Man-Boy Love Association, which was a real pro-pedophilia advocacy group that actually existed in the United States at the time the episode aired. It had members. It held meetings. It had a website. It had, famously, been in a prolonged legal fight over control of a web address that another group, made up of people who looked like the actor Marlon Brando, had been using for years. The second group was called the North American Marlon Brando Lookalikes. They shared the same 4 letters as the pro-pedophilia group. The writers of South Park had found this out during research and could not believe it was real. The entire plot of the episode spins out from that coincidence. Cartman ends up accidentally joining the real NAMBLA because a different character sends him to the Marlon Brando NAMBLA first, and he keeps getting the two mixed up. The show does something with this setup that almost no show would attempt. It plays the pedophile group as the actual bad guys of the episode, not as a joke target, not as background, as the villains of the story. Stan and Kyle, near the end of the episode, confront the leader of the pedophile group as he tries to give a speech about being an oppressed minority. Kyle, who through the whole show is basically the moral voice of the 4 boys, tells the leader in very direct language that he is someone engaged in deeply inappropriate behavior involving minors, and that no speech he gives is going to change that. Stan tells him that the boys believe in tolerance for many things, but that what the leader has done and is trying to do is a crime against children. The episode ends with the members of the group being arrested by federal agents. It is one of the clearest moral statements the show has ever made, and it is wrapped inside a story that, on its surface, has no business working at all. That is the surface of the episode. Underneath it, there is a second plot, and this is the part where even people who defended the main story had trouble defending the show. Kenny's mother is trying to have another baby. Kenny does not want her to have another baby. Kenny's reasoning is partly financial, because his family is poor and a new baby will stretch the food even thinner, and partly personal, because he does not want a new sibling taking attention away from him. So Kenny spends the entire episode trying, in escalating ways, to stop the pregnancy from happening. He throws a baseball at his father's private parts as hard as he can. He fills his mother's favorite drink, which she takes whenever she is sad, with abortion pills, and the drink ends up being consumed by his father instead, which sets off a long and graphic bathroom scene. And then, in the most disturbing move of the subplot, Kenny convinces his parents to go with him to a theme park, where he takes them on a ride called the John Denver Experience. The ride is a recreation of the plane crash that killed the real-life singer John Denver in 1997. In the cartoon, the ride is designed to cause enough enough physical shock to induce a miscarriage. Kenny's whole goal across the subplot is to end the pregnancy before it can go any further. This subplot aired on a major American cable channel in June of 2000. The reaction was immediate in some places and invisible in others, which is one of the stranger things about this episode's history. In the United States, there was almost no mainstream media response. The episode aired, shocked some viewers, and was not pulled from circulation. Comedy Central did not pull it. It stayed on air. It stayed on the DVD box set for season 4. It is still on the show's official website today. Part of the reason for this, according to later analysis, was that the main plot of the episode, the pedophile plot, was treated so clearly as a critique of pedophiles that even viewers who were uncomfortable with the setup could see that the show was not endorsing what it was showing. The villains lost. The children were saved. The moral was about as clear as South Park ever makes a moral. In the United Kingdom, the reaction was different. A channel called Sky One looked at the episode, looked at the subplot involving a child trying to end his mother's pregnancy, looked at the depiction of the pedophile group, and decided they could not air it. They banned it outright. Not edited, not delayed, banned. For years, viewers in the United Kingdom could only see Cartman Joins NAMBLA through other channels, like Channel 4 or Comedy Central's own British version. And even then, it was often shown late at night with content warnings. The episode does appear on the British DVD release of season 4, and it is available now on streaming services there. But the original Sky One ban stood for a long time and made it one of the most restricted episodes of South Park outside the later Muhammad controversies. Here is the buried production detail that makes the episode even stranger. Parker and Stone have said on DVD commentary that the whole idea for the episode came to them during a writing retreat they had taken on a cheap cruise ship to Ensenada in Mexico. They said the trip itself was miserable. The boat was bad, the food was bad, the ports they visited were bad. They went to bed unhappy and woke up unhappy. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, they started joking about the NAMBLA name coincidence story, and by the time the cruise was over, they had the episode. That is the secret of season 4 that most fans never hear. One of the single most dangerous and most banned episodes in the show's history was built out of a bad vacation and a legal dispute between a real pedophile group and a club of Marlon Brando fans. There is another part of season 4 worth knowing about because it is connected. A few months after Cartman Joins NAMBLA aired, the show put out another episode that is not often discussed, called The Wacky Molestation Adventure. In that episode, Kyle learns that he can get rid of his parents, who will not let him go to a concert, by calling the police and accusing them of molesting him. Every child in South Park copies him. All of the adults are carted away. The town is left entirely in the hands of children, who then descend into a kind of chaos. The episode is basically a dark retelling of the novel Lord of the Flies, with the additional detail that the only way to get the story moving is to have every child in town make a false accusation of child abuse against their own parents. In today's television environment, that episode almost certainly would not be made. In 2000, it aired without major controversy, in the same season as the NAMBLA episode, on the same network. This is the part of South Park's production history that rarely makes the highlight reels. The show was testing the absolute edge of what a cartoon could put on the air, and in that one season alone, it put 2 separate episodes on American television that dealt in different ways with false and real accusations of child abuse. The fact that only one of them got banned in one country is, in some ways, harder to believe than the content itself. There is a reason all of this was possible in season 4, and it comes back to something Parker has said many times in different interviews. The show had almost no institutional resistance to what it wanted to do at that time. Comedy Central had learned, across the first 3 seasons, that if they tried to block Parker and Stone from making an episode, the two of them would make it a fight, and the fight would almost always end up going public. It was easier for the network to let the episodes air and then manage the complaints after. The structure of the show's production, where each episode was written, voiced, and animated in about a week, also meant that there was no time for the network to weigh in on anything before the episode was basically finished. Comedy Central would often see an episode for the first time only a few days before it was scheduled to go to air, and by then, the decision to air or not air it had to be made in hours, not weeks. That is how an episode like Cartman Joins NAMBLA got onto television in the year 2000. Not because everyone at the network agreed with it, but because there was no system in place to stop it, and because the creators of the show had already established that they would not back down if anyone tried. What is still unsettling about the episode today is how accurate its depiction of internet predators turned out to be. The tactics shown in the cartoon, the slow trust building, the gifts, the offers of friendship, the move from private messages to meeting in person, are the same tactics that law enforcement enforcement agencies would spend the next 2 decades teaching parents to watch for. A children's cartoon was describing, in June of 2000, a crime pattern that most adults did not yet fully understand. The show was early on this, not in a way that anyone asked for it to be, and not in a way that makes the episode easier to watch, but early nonetheless. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. By the end of season 4, Parker and Stone were already planning what was going to come next. They wanted to test a different line. Not a topic line this time, but a language line. They wanted to see how many times they could say a single specific word on American cable television without anyone stopping them. They had been told for years that they were allowed to use the word a small number of times per episode. They decided to find out what would happen if they used it not a small number of times, but over 160. Whether the network would cut them off, whether the government would step in, whether the episode would even make it to broadcast. The experiment they ran and the on-screen counter they put in the corner of the screen to keep track of it is the next thing we need to talk about. Section 5. The experiment that put a counter in the corner of the screen. By the start of season 5, Parker and Stone had figured out how to get almost anything they wanted past their own network. They had learned in season 1 that test audiences did not matter if the real audience showed up. They had learned in season 2 that pranks could cost them, but not cost them the show. They had learned in season 4 that entire countries might ban an episode, and Comedy Central, back home, would still keep airing it. After 4 full years of making this show, the two of them had built up something that almost no other creators in American television had at the time. They had leverage. Real leverage. If the network pushed back too hard on anything they wanted to do, they could threaten to walk, and the network knew the show would not survive without them. They decided in the summer of 2001 to use that leverage on something specific. They wanted to test the line around a single word. The word was a 4-letter word that most American broadcast television will not say. On cable, which is what Comedy Central is, the rules are looser than on regular over-the-air television because cable is a service people pay for instead of a public broadcast, and the government has less control over what can be said on it. But even on cable, there were understood limits. You could say the word sometimes. You could say it in context. You could not, by any standard that existed in 2001, build an entire episode around saying it on a loop. Nobody had ever tried. There was no model for what the reaction would be. What made Parker and Stone want to try this was a real thing happening in the television industry at the time. The show NYPD Blue, which aired on the network ABC, had been allowed to say the word in question once or twice per episode, under heavily negotiated rules with the government broadcasting authority. The deal was that they could say it for dramatic effect in specific scenes, as long as the overall use of the word was kept low. Parker and Stone found this funny. They thought the whole idea that a word became acceptable if you only said it a small number of times, but dangerous if you said it many times, was a joke in itself. The word was either okay or it was not. Measuring the damage of a word by counting it seemed to them like a perfect thing to make fun of. So they wrote an episode built entirely around that joke. The episode is called It Hits the Fan. It is the first episode of season 5. It aired on June 20th, 2001, and across its 22-minute runtime, the word in question is said, out loud, uncensored, 162 times. Parker and Stone did not come to that number by accident. They counted every instance during the writing process. They went back through the script and made sure the count landed exactly where they wanted it to. On an average basis, across the whole episode, that comes out to roughly 1 use of the word every 8 seconds. The only moments of the episode where it is not being said are the moments of silence between scenes and the brief sections where the word is written on screen instead of spoken aloud. Those written uses were counted separately, and there are another 38 of those in the episode, which brings the total, if you include them, to exactly 200. 200 uses of a single word in a single episode of a cartoon aired on basic cable. And to make sure nobody missed what they were doing, the show put a counter in the bottom corner of the screen. The counter ticks up every time the word is said. You can watch it climb during the episode. Some viewers have said that the counter becomes more memorable than the plot of the episode itself. That was the point. Parker and Stone wanted the audience to understand exactly what they were watching. Not a clever joke hidden inside a story, an experiment played out in real time about what a word actually means when you hear it enough times. The plot of the episode, for the record, is built to support the experiment. The main characters of the show hear that a popular television police drama is going to say the word uncensored on air for the first time in that show's history. The whole town gets excited about it. Everyone clears their schedules to watch the broadcast. After the broadcast, the word spreads through the town. People say it to each other constantly. Then, the word starts to have physical effects on the people saying it. A disease breaks out that causes people to vomit up their own insides. A dragon, which in the story is tied to the word through ancient prophecy, wakes up. The episode turns in its last act into a sort of fantasy adventure about stopping the dragon, which serves as the show's way of saying that swearing does have consequences, but not the ones people usually think it does. The real point of the episode is that using a taboo word so often causes the word itself to lose meaning. By the end of the episode, the characters are bored of saying it. They move on to other words. One character, Cartman, tries saying the phrase "me crob," which is a Thai appetizer, and tries to convince everyone that it is more disgusting than the actual curse word. The episode's final moral, stated out loud, is that overusing any word drains the power out of it. What Parker and Stone expected, going into production, was that Comedy Central would push back hard on this. They expected a fight. They expected the network to say the word could be said a few times, but not 162. They prepared their arguments. They got ready to have the whole conversation about creative freedom and cable standards. The fight never happened. Comedy Central looked at the episode, watched it through, and said yes. According to Matt Stone's own account later, the executives at the network decided that because the use of the word was the whole point of the episode, rather than the episode being a normal story that happened to contain swearing, it was actually a meaningful artistic choice, and they let it go through untouched. Parker and Stone were, in both of their words later, genuinely shocked. They had walked in expecting a fight and walked out with a yes. The only thing Comedy Central asked for was that the episode be rated for mature audiences and aired late in the evening, which was already going to happen anyway. The episode aired, and the part of the story that is almost harder to believe than anything else is what did not happen next. There was no big public controversy. There was no government investigation. There were no massive fines. There were some complaints, but the volume of complaint mail was, by the standards of what the show had triggered in earlier seasons, small. Matt Stone gave a simple explanation for this in a later interview. He said, essentially, that the cultural standards around this word had already loosened so much by 2001 that almost nobody cared anymore. The limits on language that had been in place across most of the show's first 4 years were already, by the time season 5 started, mostly symbolic. The show used the word 200 times, and the reaction was, for the most part, a shrug. What happened next is the part that matters most for television history. By proving, with a single episode, that the word could be said uncensored in that volume without the sky falling, Parker and Stone opened a door that had been closed for decades. Other cable shows began using the word more freely. The argument that the word could only be used a few times per episode, or only for specific dramatic effect, started falling apart, because It Hits the Fan had already disproved it. The exact path of how cable language standards changed across the 2000s is complicated and involves many shows and many executives, but people who have studied the history of it point to this one episode as a turning point. The limits on what could be said on cable loosened because a cartoon had pushed them and won. There's a detail inside the episode that usually gets missed, and it is where the show's deeper point lives. Mr. Garrison, the boy's teacher, is shown using a different slur during the episode, a word that is a slur against gay men. The joke in the episode is that Mr. Garrison, who is a gay man himself, is allowed to say the word uncensored because of who he is, while straight characters in the same scene get bleeped when they try to say the same word. The show is pointing at a real double standard in American language rules around who is allowed to say what, and doing it in a way that nobody really expected a cartoon to do in 2001. That single joke is one of the first times on American television that anyone tried to address, comedically, the idea that slurs can be acceptable depending on the speaker, and the episode uses it to make its broader point about language. The word you cannot say in one context, you can say in another, and the boundary between the two is drawn by rules that do not make consistent sense. The counter in the corner of the screen became, over time, one of the most recognized visual gags in the history of the show. It has been referenced in other Comedy Central shows. It shows up in best of lists of television moments from the 2000s. Comedy Central itself listed the episode as one of 10 episodes of South Park that changed the medium. Here's the production secret inside season 5 that most people do not know. Parker and Stone almost did not go through with the full number. According to the DVD commentary, they had had originally planned to use the word only a few times, enough to set up the joke and then back off. Comedy Central was the one that, once they agreed to let the idea go forward at all, pushed back on the idea of keeping the count small. The network, according to Stone, told them that if they were going to do it, they had to commit. Use it a lot. Use it so much that the audience cannot ignore what is happening. If you say it 3 times, it is just swearing. If you say it 162 times, it is a statement. The network was the one asking for the bigger number. Think about that for a second. In almost every story about South Park pushing a limit, the usual pattern is that the creators are pushing and the network is trying to hold the line. In this one specific case, the network was the one asking the creators to push harder. Comedy Central had realized by season 5 that its whole brand was being built on this show being willing to do what other shows would not. A softer version of the episode would have been a worse deal for the network than the extreme version. The extreme version was what people would talk about. The extreme version was what would end up in the news. The extreme version was what would get people to subscribe to their cable package to see what else the show might do. For the first time in the show's history, the network was actively encouraging Parker and Stone to go further than they had planned to go on their own. This set a pattern that would last for the next 10 years of the show. Once Comedy Central figured out that the worst thing they could do, financially, was stop the show from doing something extreme, they mostly stopped stopping them. Entire episodes that would have been pulled apart in note sessions on any other network started going through with barely a change. The network had learned that being the home of the thing people could not believe they were seeing was the single most valuable position a cable channel could have. Parker and Stone had leverage. Comedy Central had figured out that the leverage, if left alone, made everyone richer. That is the real secret of season 5. The episode that became famous for a joke was also the moment the balance of power inside the show's production permanently shifted. After season 5, Parker and Stone were not really asking permission anymore. They were telling. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And they would keep telling for years. Most of the time, this meant the show could do extreme things and the network would let them. Some of the time, it meant Parker and Stone would push a specific idea so hard that even their most loyal fans pushed back. One of those moments came in the very next season, when the two of them decided to do something that, on paper, should have ended a running joke that had defined the show since day one. They killed off one of the 4 main characters. Not for an episode, not as a gag, for real. They moved his name out of the opening theme song. They rewrote the main cast. They planned for him to stay gone. And what happened in the months after that decision, including the threats the network received from fans and the phone calls that came in to try to force the character back, is the next piece of this story. Section 6. The character they killed and tried to keep dead. To understand what happened in season 6, you have to go back to the start of the show and think about the one joke that defined South Park in the minds of almost everyone who watched it in those early years. Across every single episode of the first 5 seasons, one of the 4 main characters would die. His name was Kenny. He wore a bright orange parka with the hood pulled tight around his face so that all you could see were his eyes and nothing else. You could not even understand what he was saying because the parka muffled his voice so badly that his dialogue came out as a kind of low muffled sound. He would get killed in some awful and usually ridiculous way, at least once per episode. And 2 of the other main characters, Stan and Kyle, would say their lines about it. Stan would shout out that Kenny had been killed. Kyle would shout the word bastards in response. Rats would show up to chew on the body. Then the next episode would start and Kenny would be back, alive and in his parka with no explanation at all. This happened in the pilot. It happened in the Christmas special. It happened in the movie. It happened in episode after episode for 5 straight years. It was, by the end of the run, the single most recognizable piece of the entire show. There were t-shirts about it. There were posters. There were catchphrases tied to it that people shouted at each other in schools and offices. Kenny's deaths were the running joke that the show was, in some ways, most famous for, and Parker and Stone were bored of them. That is the part of this story that does not always get explained clearly. It was not that the audience was tired of the running joke. The audience loved it. The joke was still working. The problem was that the 2 people who had to come up with a new way to kill the same character every single week were running out of ideas. You can only drop a spaceship on a boy so many times. You can only have him hit by so many different vehicles. After 5 years and roughly 70 episodes, the 2 of them were spending real writer's room time every week trying to figure out a fresh way to put him in the ground, and they had started to resent it. Matt Stone said it plainly in an interview in 2002. The gag had started out as fun and turned into work. The character himself had become, in Parker's own words, a a prop more than a character. He did not speak in a way the audience could understand. He did not have real storylines. He did not interact much with the other boys beyond being present in the scenes. His whole function in the show had narrowed down to one thing: die, over and over, so the other characters could say their lines and the audience could cheer. The two of them decided to fix this the hard way. They decided to kill him off for good. The episode is called Kenny Dies. It is the 13th episode of season 5. It aired on December 5th, 2001. And instead of playing his death as a joke, the way every previous death had been played, the episode played it completely straight. Kenny is diagnosed with a serious muscular disease. The episode follows the slow decline of his health across its full runtime. The other boys visit him in the hospital. Stan, the character who has been shouting the catchphrase about Kenny's deaths for 5 straight years, cannot bring himself to enter the hospital room because this time the death is real. The episode ends with Kenny actually dying in bed on screen as a quiet piece of music plays. There are no rats. There is no resurrection. The next episode does not undo it. Parker and Stone were serious about keeping him gone. They moved his name out of the opening theme song. In the original theme, Kenny has a verse where he sings his own part, and nobody can understand what he is saying because of the parka. For season 6, that verse was removed, and a new verse was added for the character Timmy, who sings in a simpler way. The show, on a structural level, was restructuring itself to live without Kenny. The 4 boys became 3 boys, plus whoever the writers wanted to bring in that episode. The first replacement they tried was Butters. Butters had been on the show since the very beginning as a minor background character, but he had almost never spoken a full line of dialogue until season 2. Across seasons 3 and 4, Parker and Stone had started giving him more to do because they had found in him something they could not find in Kenny. Butters could talk. Butters could feel things. Butters could cry and laugh and be confused and be manipulated. He had the range of a real character. So when they killed Kenny, they slotted Butters into the main 4. This lasted for 5 episodes. In the 6th episode of season 6, called Professor Chaos, the other 3 boys fire Butters from the main group, telling him that he is too boring to be one of them. The episode plays this firing as a straight rejection. Butters, devastated, goes home and creates a supervillain identity for himself, calling himself Professor Chaos, and spends the rest of the season causing small, pathetic acts of destruction in the town while planning his revenge on the world. This is one of the most emotionally direct storylines the show had done up to that point, and it is all built on the foundation of Kenny being gone. Butters becomes a full character because he is filling a hole that was made when Kenny died. After Butters was fired, the boys held auditions for the new 4th member of the group. They parodied the reality dating show The Bachelor. A different character named Tweak won the competition. Tweak was a nervous, jittery boy with wild hair who was constantly drinking coffee and twitching. He joined the main group for a few episodes. He did not quite fit either. The group kept trying. Nothing was working. And this is the point at which the real pressure on the show started to show up from outside. Here is the part of the season 6 story that almost nobody remembers because it has mostly been written out of the popular history of the show. Fans hated that Kenny was gone. Not all of them, but a specific segment of the audience, loud and organized, did not just complain. They threatened to stop watching. They threatened to boycott Comedy Central entirely. They wrote to the network demanding his return. The volume of the pushback was, according to Matt Stone's own account later, smaller than the media coverage suggested, but it was real enough that the network took it seriously. Comedy Central started asking Parker and Stone, quietly, how long the plan to keep Kenny gone was going to last. The network had already seen, across the previous 5 years, that this one character was central to the merchandising of the show. Every piece of South Park merchandise that sold well featured Kenny somewhere on it. Every piece of promotional art for the show included him. Removing him from the main 4 meant removing him from a large amount of the show's commercial life. The network was losing money in slow ways with every episode that went by without him in it. This put Parker and Stone in a position they had not really been in before. In earlier seasons, the fights with the network had been about what they wanted to include. The fights had been about how much violence, how much swearing, how much religious material, how much everything. The network was usually trying to pull them back. On Kenny, the situation was reversed. Parker and Stone wanted to keep him dead. The network wanted him back. And the audience, or at least a loud part of it, wanted him back so badly that they were willing to leave the show over it. For most of season 6, the 2 creators held the line. Kenny stayed gone. The boys kept trying replacements. Tweak drifted out of the main 4 in the episode called Child Abduction is Not Funny. There were a few episodes in the middle of the season that dealt with Kenny indirectly. In one storyline, storyline across 3 connected episodes called A Ladder to Heaven, The Return of the Fellowship of the Ring to the Two Towers, and The Biggest Douche in the Universe, the writers introduced the idea that Cartman had accidentally drunk Kenny's cremated ashes, thinking they were chocolate milk powder, and that Kenny's soul was now trapped inside Cartman's body. This allowed Kenny to speak through Cartman in a few scenes. It was the first time since his death that he had been a presence in the show in any real way, but it was a workaround. It was not a resurrection. By the end of the season, the pressure had become something Parker and Stone could not keep ignoring. They made the call to bring him back. The season finale, called Red Sleigh Down, aired on December 11th, 2002. It was a Christmas episode. Across almost the entire runtime, there is no sign that Kenny is going to return. The story is about Santa Claus being captured by Iraqis, and the boys, along with Jesus, having to rescue him. It is a normal, late Kenny era episode. Then, in the final seconds, Kenny shows up. He is simply there. He walks onto the screen. The other boys react with brief surprise. Stan asks him where he has been. Kenny points off to his right and mumbles, and the episode ends. That is it. That is how he comes back. No explanation, no big emotional scene, just a shrug, a point, and an end credits sequence. Parker and Stone made a specific choice in the way they brought him back. They did not give him the dignity of a real resurrection scene because they did not want to signal that the decision to bring him back had been a big deal. They wanted the return to feel as offhand as possible, almost disrespectful, like the show was shrugging at its own fans for making them do this. It was a compromise, not a victory. Kenny came back because the audience demanded it and the network supported the demand. But Parker and Stone put just enough middle finger into the actual return that you can feel, even 20 plus years later, that they were not happy about it. After season 6, a few things shifted permanently. Kenny was back, but the rule that he would die in every episode was over. He still died sometimes, but it happened rarely. In most episodes from season 7 onwards, he is just there, alive, speaking the same muffled speech as always, being one of the 4 boys. The running joke that had defined the show's first 5 years was quietly retired. The catchphrase that Stan and Kyle had used in response to his deaths, the one that had been shouted in schoolyards across the world for years, was heard less and less often. The gag that had been the single most recognizable thing about South Park slowly faded out, and after a while, the show was not even really the show about the boy who dies every week anymore. It had become something else. Butters is the character who benefited most from the whole experiment. Even after Kenny returned and Butters was pushed back out of the main 4, the 5 episodes he had spent as a main character had given him enough screen time and enough depth that Parker and Stone could no longer write him as a minor background presence. He kept getting his own episodes. He got larger storylines. He became, by the later seasons of the show, one of the most loved characters in the entire series. A lot of fans today will tell you that their favorite character on South Park is Butters, and that is only possible because Kenny was killed off for a year and the writers needed someone to fill the space. Tweak, the second replacement, did not have the same luck. After his brief time in the main 4, he faded back into the background where he had started. He remained a recurring character, but his moment had passed. Here is the production secret of season 6 that the creators have admitted in commentary, but that most fans do not know. Parker has said, flatly, that Kyle was the character they had originally talked about killing off, not Kenny. The reasoning was that Kyle and Stan, the 2 best friends at the center of the show, had grown to become too similar to each other, and that the show might benefit from replacing one of them with someone more different. Butters was originally going to be Kyle's replacement. They picked Kenny instead because Kenny was the one with the smallest role, the prop character, the one whose permanent death would be the most practical. If they had gone the other way, the entire emotional center of the show would have shifted. Stan would have lost his best friend. The Jewish-Catholic dynamic between Kyle and Cartman, which drives dozens of major episodes in the show's later years, would never have existed. The version of South Park we have now is a different version from the one they almost made. That is what season 6 really is. A season about a creative decision that the audience did not let stick. A year-long experiment in running the show without the character everyone thought was necessary. A fight between the writers and their own fans about what the show was allowed to be. A quiet rewrite of what Butters, and by extension the whole second half of the series, would eventually become. And a moment where the creators realized, for the first time, that even with all their leverage, they were not the only people with a say in what the show became. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. After the fight over Kenny ended, Parker and Stone went into a stretch of seasons where their confidence in pushing boundaries was higher than it had ever been. They had proved that they could say anything, push any limit, bring back anyone. What they had not yet been tested on was timing. Not what they said, but when they said it. Whether a cartoon made in a single week could respond to a real-world event happening right now. Whether an episode could go to air in the same 24-hour window as the death of a real human being who had been at the center of a national debate. And whether, when they tried to do that, the timing would be wrong by the difference of a single day. That is where this story goes next. Section 7. The episode that aired hours before a real woman died. To understand Season 9 properly, you have to understand one thing about how South Park is actually made. Most animated shows in America take between 8 and 9 months to finish a single episode. The script gets written, the voices get recorded, the animation gets sent to a team overseas, usually in South Korea, where it is drawn by hand one frame at a time. Then it comes back, then it gets edited, then it gets music put on it. The process is slow. It has to be slow. That is why most cartoons you see on television are working off of news from last year, not last week. South Park is different. South Park is made in 6 days. Parker, Stone, and a small team start fresh on a Thursday morning. They sit in a room and write the episode that day. They record the voices the next day. They animate through the weekend. They do sound and music at the start of the next week. By Wednesday night, the episode goes up to Comedy Central by satellite feed, sometimes only a few hours before it is scheduled to air. The whole thing is built in a single working week. That is why the show, when it wants to, can talk about something that happened 2 or 3 days before the episode goes out. No other show in American animation can do this. It is the single biggest technical advantage the show has. In March of 2005, Parker and Stone used that advantage in a way that put them directly on top of one of the most painful news stories in America at that moment. The story was about a woman named Terry Schiavo. Terry Schiavo was a real person. She was born in 1963 in Pennsylvania. In 1990, when she was 26 years old, she collapsed at her home in Florida. Her heart had stopped for long enough that her brain had been badly damaged by the lack of oxygen. She survived, but she never fully woke up again. For the next 15 years, she was in what doctors call a persistent vegetative state, which means that her body was still alive, but the parts of her brain that make a person awake and aware were gone. She could not speak. She could not follow movements with her eyes. She could not recognize her own family. She could breathe on her own, but she could not eat. And so she was kept alive by a feeding tube running directly into her stomach. Her husband, Michael Schiavo, said that Terry had told him, before her collapse, that she would not want to be kept alive like this. Her parents disagreed. They wanted her kept on the feeding tube. The two sides went to court, and the court case went on for years, passing through multiple judges and appeals. By the early 2000s, the case had become one of the most watched legal fights in the country. It touched on religion, on the right to die, on what counts as life, on who gets to speak for a person who cannot speak for themselves. Conservative politicians got involved. Religious leaders got involved. Protesters camped outside the hospice where she was being kept. In March of 2005, the feeding tube was removed. From that point on, it was only a matter of days before she would die of natural causes. The whole country was watching. Every news channel had live coverage. Every political talk show was arguing about it. Parker and Stone had already been working on a different episode. It was called The Losing Edge. It was a baseball episode. They had the idea. They had started planning it. They were about to begin production. Then they changed their minds. Matt Stone has said in commentary that they felt at that moment that the Terry Schiavo story was the single biggest thing happening in the country, and that they could not simply ignore it and put out a baseball episode that week. Trey Parker has said the same thing, using the exact comparison that it was the biggest story in American life since the events of September 2001. They decided to throw out the baseball plan and build a new episode from scratch about the Schiavo case in the remaining working days they had. Parker has said on the DVD commentary that the structure of the new episode came together in about 30 minutes. 30 minutes! A full 22-minute story with a beginning, a middle, an end, and a moral put together in the time it takes most people to eat a meal. He has said this was the fastest he and Matt had ever come up with an episode, and that this kind of speed almost never happens, even in their very fast working process. The episode is called Best Friends Forever. It is the 4th episode of season 9. It aired on March 30th, 2005, and it is, to this day, one of the most emotionally strange episodes the show has ever produced. The plot works like this. Kenny, who has been mostly in the background since his return at the end of season 6, is shown in the opening of the episode as the first person in the town to get a brand new portable video game device. The device is real. It was called the PlayStation Portable, and in real life, it had been released in the United States less than a week before the episode aired. Kenny becomes obsessed with the game he is playing on it, which is called Heaven vs. Hell. While playing the game outside, Kenny is hit by an ice cream truck and killed. This is, notably, the first major death for Kenny since his return. Kenny arrives in heaven. It turns out that the video game he was playing was actually a test designed by God, meant to find the one human being on Earth who would have the strategic skill to lead the forces of heaven in a coming war against hell. Kenny is that person. He is the chosen leader. Heaven needs him to be dead and spiritually ready to fight. But on Earth, something goes wrong. The doctors manage to bring Kenny's body back to life, except they only bring back his body. His soul is already in heaven. His body is now lying in a hospital bed in what the episode calls a permanent vegetative state. He is not awake. He will not wake up. He is being kept alive by a feeding tube. This is the direct parallel to Schiavo. The episode is not hiding it. The writers are not trying to disguise what they are doing. They are putting the exact real-world debate onto their cartoon character and running it through the machine of their show. Cartman wants the feeding tube removed. He wants Kenny dead, not out of compassion, but because under Kenny's will, Cartman is the one who inherits the new video game system if Kenny dies. Cartman spends the episode campaigning for the tube to come out. Stan and Kyle want the tube to stay in. They want Kenny alive in any form. The two sides fight, politicians get involved, the news media turns the whole thing into a spectacle. Protesters show up with signs, one of the townspeople tries to smuggle food and water to the bedside and is arrested, which is a direct reference to real protesters who had been arrested outside Schiavo's hospice for the same thing. The episode ends with the discovery of a missing page of Kenny's actual will, which makes his wishes clear. He would not want to be kept alive like this. The tube is removed. Kenny dies again. His soul, finally free, gets to fight the war in heaven that he was chosen for. The moral of the episode, stated directly, is that both sides of the real Schiavo debate had turned a private family matter into a public show that nobody involved actually wanted. The episode aired on March 30th, 2005, at 10 o'clock at night in the United States. Terry Schiavo died the next morning, March 31st, 2005. Less than 12 hours after the episode went out on American television, the woman whose case it was satirizing was dead in real life. The timing was not planned. Parker and Stone did not know when they locked the episode exactly when she would die. The feeding tube had been removed on March 18th. From that point on, everyone knew the end was close. They had been told, like the rest of the country had been told, that it could happen at any moment. They made the bet that it would be worth doing the episode anyway, and they made it with the knowledge that they were cutting the timing extremely close. They did not realize how close. Nobody did. The episode and the death ended up separated by a single overnight gap. Parker and Stone had also been planning for this to be a two-part episode. The Schiavo story was complicated enough, and the Heaven versus Hell story they had built around it was big enough that they had mapped out a second episode to continue it the following week. After Terry Schiavo actually died, the two of them met and decided they could not do the second part. Matt Stone said in commentary that with the real woman dead, continuing to build jokes out of the same situation for another full episode felt wrong to both of them. They killed the second part. The episode they had made stood alone. The reaction to Best Friends Forever is where the story becomes strange in a way that nobody expected. Some viewers were horrified by the timing. Some writers and commentators called the episode tasteless, exploitative, and cruel. Some parents of people in actual long-term comas wrote to the network. But the larger reaction, from critics and from the industry, was praise. Many reviewers said the episode handled the moral question at the center of the Schiavo case more clearly and more honestly than most news coverage had. The suggestion that both sides had turned a private tragedy into a public fight, and that the person at the center of it had been failed by everyone who claimed to speak for her, landed in a way that straight news reports had struggled to land. The episode went on to win the Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Animated Program later that year. It was the first Emmy that South Park had ever won, after being nominated 4 separate times in previous years. In the category, it beat The Simpsons, it beat Family Guy, it beat King of the Hill, a show built in 6 days, written in 30 minutes of storyboarding, based on a news story that had been ongoing while the episode was being made, and aired the night before the real woman at the center of the story died, won the award for the best animated show of the year. There is one more piece of the season 9 story that has to be mentioned, because it sits in the same season and it shows the same creators making almost the opposite kind of mistake. Later in the same season, in December of 2005, South Park aired the season finale called Bloody Mary. It was a story about a statue of the Virgin Mary, the mother of Jesus, that appeared to be bleeding. The episode treated the Virgin Mary in a way that the Catholic Church found deeply insulting. The Catholic League, an organized Catholic advocacy group, complained officially. A senior member of the network's own parent company, a Catholic himself, publicly condemned the episode. The bishop in charge of the Catholic bishops of the United States sent a letter of complaint directly to the head of the network. Comedy Central, which had held firm for the Shivo episode, quietly pulled Bloody Mary from its rerun schedule at the end of 2005. It came back on air later, but the moments of the network buckling had been public. Australia banned it for 10 years. Other countries refused to air it at all. So season 9 contains both the episode that earned the show its first Emmy and the episode that gave the network its first real public moments of retreat. The same creators, the same 6-day schedule, the same willingness to push, and two very different outcomes sitting in the same year of the same show. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. After season 9, Parker and Stone went into season 10 with a confidence that had grown beyond anything they had held before. They had won an Emmy. They had put the network on the back foot over Bloody Mary and survived. And they were about to use that confidence to do something that, in their own minds later, they thought was fully justified. But that involved a man who was, at that exact moment, unable to speak for himself at all. The voice actor who had played one of the warmest characters in the entire show had just had a stroke. He could not even hold a conversation, and a decision was being made in his name by people around him that Parker and Stone would only fully understand years later. What they did on air in response, and what they found out afterwards about who had actually made the decision, is where this goes next. Section 8. The man who could not speak for himself. Chef had been a part of South Park since the very first episode. He was the school cafeteria cook, a big, warm black man with a deep singing voice, who gave the four boys advice they did not always understand, and sang them songs that were usually a little too adult for children to be hearing. In a show built around the bad behavior of everyone in town, Chef was one of the only characters the boys actually trusted. He was the voice of calm when everything else was chaos. He was a figure of kindness in a town that did not have much of it. Across 9 full seasons of the show, across more than 130 episodes, Chef was one of the anchors of the whole cast. Fans loved him. The man who played him was a real musician, an enormous presence in American music history named Isaac Hayes. Hayes was born in Tennessee in 1942. He had grown up poor, the son of a father who left and a mother who died when he was very young. He had been raised by his grandparents. He taught himself music. He became, by the end of the 1960s, one of the most important figures in Southern soul music. He wrote songs that are still famous today. He won an Oscar in 1972 for a song he wrote for the movie Shaft. He was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Before he was the voice of Chef, he was already one of the most respected recording artists in the world. When Parker and Stone offered him the role, he said yes because he liked the script and because the character let him sing, which was the thing he had been doing his whole life. From the pilot onward, Hayes was in the show. For 9 seasons, he showed up to record his dialogue and sing his songs. He was, by every available account, warm and professional. He got along with Parker and Stone. He enjoyed the work. He cashed his paychecks. The relationship was, by the standards of how these things usually go, about as healthy as a long-running voice acting job can be. Then 2 things happened, close to each other in time, that broke everything. The first was a religious issue. Isaac Hayes in the early 1990s had joined the Church of Scientology. Scientology is a modern religion that was created in the middle of the 20th century by a science fiction writer. It has celebrities in its membership, it has strong views about its own teachings, and it has a history of reacting badly to outside criticism. Hayes had been a member for years by the time this story begins. He had never publicly objected to the show making fun of other religions. South Park had mocked Christians, it had mocked Jews, it had mocked Mormons in an entire episode dedicated to the origins of the Mormon faith without causing any trouble with Hayes. He had cashed all of those checks without complaint. In November of 2005, South Park aired an episode called Trapped in the Closet. The episode is about Scientology. It lays out the actual beliefs of the religion on screen, with a small on-screen notice saying that what is being shown is what Scientologists genuinely believe. It mocks Tom Cruise, a famous Scientologist actor, by showing him repeatedly refusing to come out of a closet. The episode was extremely harsh on the church. Scientology is known to be aggressive about criticism. Hayes, who had been silent about every other religious parody the show had done, was placed in a difficult position. Here is the important part. Right after the episode aired, Hayes did not seem to be in crisis over it. In January January of 2006, he appeared on a radio show and a magazine interview where he actually defended the show. He said in so many words that even though he was not happy with the episode about Scientology, he understood what Parker and Stone were doing, and he was not going to stop working with them. He made this statement publicly on multiple outlets in the first month of 2006. Then, in that same month, January of 2006, Isaac Hayes had a stroke. This is the part of the story that changes everything. A stroke, when it happens in an older person, can do enormous damage to the brain very quickly. In Hayes' case, the damage was severe. It affected his ability to speak. It affected his ability to understand complicated conversations. According to his son Isaac Hayes III, who told the story later in The Hollywood Reporter, his father had to relearn how to play the piano. He had trouble stringing sentences together. He was, in the weeks and months after the stroke, nowhere near the man he had been a few months earlier. On March 13th, 2006, 2 months after the stroke, a public statement was released in Hayes' name. The statement said that Hayes was quitting South Park. It said that he was no longer willing to be part of the show. It used specific language about how the show had gone too far and crossed the line from satire into bigotry against religion. It named no one religion in particular. It sounded like an ordinary public resignation from a major voice actor, delivered in professional language. Parker and Stone read the statement. They were, by their own account later, extremely angry. They felt the statement was hypocritical. They believed Hayes had been fine with them mocking every other religion, but drew the line when his own religion was mocked. Matt Stone went on the record saying so publicly. He said Hayes had cashed his checks while the show made fun of everyone else's faith and only objected when his own was next. The statement from Hayes and the response from Stone became a public fight in the entertainment press. Parker and Stone, in retaliation, decided to write Chef out of the show in the most brutal way they could. The episode they made is called The Return of Chef. It aired on March 22nd, 2006, 9 days after the resignation statement. Because Hayes was no longer working with them, they used old recordings of his voice, cut up and rearranged, to create new dialogue for Chef. In the episode, Chef has joined a group that is a clear parody of Scientology, called the Super Adventure Club. He has been, in the story, brainwashed by them. He tries to do inappropriate things to the children of the town. At the end of the episode, Chef falls off a cliff, gets impaled on branches, is attacked by a bear and a mountain lion, and dies in graphic detail. At his funeral in the same episode, Kyle gives a eulogy that is almost completely about real life. Kyle says that the boys should not be angry at Chef for leaving them. They should be angry at the club that scrambled his brain. This is a direct message to the audience. Parker and Stone were telling fans that they blamed Scientology for Hayes leaving, and they were doing it through a cartoon speech at a cartoon funeral. This is what the public story of Hayes leaving the show was, for 10 full years. Then, in 2016, The Hollywood Reporter published a long oral history of South Park to mark the 20th anniversary of the show. In that piece, Isaac Hayes III, the son of the voice actor, gave an interview in which he laid out what had actually happened behind the scenes. According to The Sun, his father did not write the resignation statement. His father did not approve it. His father was not capable of approving it. At the time the statement came out in his name, Isaac Hayes could not have a normal conversation. He could not hold up the business end of a decision like this. He was not in charge of his own schedule. He was not in charge of his own public relations. The people around him in the weeks and months after his stroke were almost entirely made up of fellow members of the Church of Scientology. His personal assistants were Scientologists. His manager had Scientology connections. His public relations team had Scientology connections. According to Hayes' son, someone in that group wrote the resignation statement and put it out under his father's name without his father being able to stop them. Isaac Hayes III said directly that his father loved being the voice of Chef and would not have quit willingly. He said his father was not the kind of man who would have worked on a show that made fun of so many other groups and then resigned only over one. He said the narrative that his father had quit in protest was a lie, made up by people who did not have his father's best interests at heart. Matt Stone, when asked about this later, essentially confirmed it. Stone said in that same oral history that he had spoken with Hayes on the phone after the Trapped in the Closet episode aired, and that it had been obvious even then that someone else was pushing Hayes to ask that the episode be pulled. Stone said that after the fact, the picture had become clearer. Hayes had not quit the show. Other people had quit it for him while he was too sick to argue. Isaac Hayes never came back to South Park. He never gave another interview about what happened. The stroke damage stayed with him for the rest of his life. He died His son would not speak publicly about what had really happened until 8 years after his father's death. This is the secret of season 10 of South Park. The episode that opens the season, the one that kills off Chef in the most violent and unpleasant way the show had ever killed off a major character, was built on the assumption that the man behind the character had chosen to leave. He had not. He had been left on his behalf by people he could not push back against. And the cartoon funeral in the episode, where Kyle tells the mourners to blame the brainwashing club instead of Chef himself, turned out to be closer to literally true than anyone at the time understood. The real Isaac Hayes had been pulled out of the show by the same forces the cartoon was accusing of pulling him out of the show. Parker and Stone got the story right by accident, years before they knew they were right. In July of 2025, Isaac Hayes III went further on the record. On social media, on his 20th anniversary of his father's resignation being the public story, he wrote a long statement saying, again, that his father had not quit. He wrote that his father had loved being in the show, had loved meeting fans who recognized his voice, and had been used. He wrote that he was speaking now because his father could not speak for himself then. The public story, 20 years on, is starting to be corrected in his own words. Across all the ways the show has been controversial, across all the fights with celebrities and religions and countries, the Chef story is the one that sits differently. There is no villain in it who is only a villain. Parker and Stone did what they thought was right with the information they had. The voice of Chef was taken from them by people they could not see. A man who had been one of the warmest presences in the entire show was written out of it in a violent way he never got to respond to. And by the time the full picture was known, he was already gone. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. By the year 2010, the show was approaching its 200th episode. Parker and Stone wanted to mark the milestone. They wanted to bring back every controversy they had ever caused and put them all in one story. They were planning to revisit religion, celebrities, and censorship all at the same time. And the show was about to run into something that had nothing to do with Scientology, nothing to do with a brainwashed voice actor, and everything to do with the real threat made by real people in the real world. What that threat was, who made it, and how Comedy Central handled it is the next thing we need to talk about. Section 9, the 200th episode and the real threat that followed it. By the start of 2010, South Park had been on the air for almost 13 years. The show had become one of the most stable things on cable television. Parker and Stone had survived the loss of a main voice actress. They had survived the departure of Isaac Hayes. They had survived fights with celebrities, fights with their own audience, fights with entire countries. The show had become, through sheer persistence, the longest-running animated program Comedy Central had ever had. It was approaching its 200th episode. Parker and Stone wanted to mark the milestone in a specific way. They did not want to do a standard anniversary episode with clip shows or guest stars. They wanted to do something the show had never really done before. They wanted to go back through everything they had ever caused trouble with, every celebrity they had insulted, every religion they had mocked, every character they had killed, and put it all into a single connected story. They wanted to make an episode that, on the surface, was a celebration of how much the show had gotten away with. Underneath, they wanted to make a statement about what they still could not get away with, because there was one topic that had been blocked from them for years, and they wanted to test whether now in the show's 13th year, they could finally say it. That topic was the Prophet Muhammad, the central religious figure of Islam. You have to understand the history here to understand why this episode became what it became. South Park had actually depicted Muhammad before, in a completely uncensored way, all the way back in season 5, in an episode called Super Best Friends. That episode aired in July of 2001, 2 months before the events of September 11th of that year. In it, Muhammad appears as one of a team of religious superheroes, alongside Jesus, Buddha, Moses, and others. He is drawn as a normal character. His name is spoken out loud. There is no censorship. At the time, there was almost no reaction. The episode aired, nobody complained in any significant way, life moved on. Then the world changed. After the attacks of September 11th, a specific strain of violent extremism began to show up around any public depiction of Muhammad. In Islam, there is a long-standing tradition that Muhammad should not be drawn or shown in visual form at all. Most Muslims follow this tradition quietly and do not react publicly when others break it. A small extremist minority treats any depiction as an act of war. In 2005, a newspaper in Denmark, the Jyllandsposten, printed a set of cartoons of Muhammad. Protests broke out across the Muslim Muslim world. Embassies were attacked. People died. The director of a Dutch film about Islam, Theo van Gogh, was murdered in 2004 in Amsterdam. A man walked up behind him in the street, shot him, stabbed him, and pinned a note to his body with a knife. The case was international news. By the year 2006, when Parker and Stone tried again to put Muhammad into the show, the atmosphere had completely changed. They made an episode called Cartoon Wars, where the main plot was about a fictional episode of a different show, Family Guy, that was going to depict Muhammad. The episode was a direct commentary on the Danish cartoons and the violence that had followed them. When the real episode aired, Comedy Central refused to show Muhammad on screen. In the exact moment the character was supposed to appear, the network placed a black card that said that Muhammad's image had been blocked by Comedy Central. The message was clear. Parker and Stone had wanted to put the character in, the network had refused. The network had made its decision out of fear. The black card was left in on purpose, so the audience would see that the network had blinked. 4 years later, for the 200th episode, Parker and Stone decided to try again. The episode, titled simply 200, aired on April 14th, 2010. It brought back almost every celebrity the show had ever insulted. Tom Cruise, Mel Gibson, Kanye West, and a full crowd of others gathered together to bring a lawsuit against the town of South Park for mocking them. Cruise offers to drop the lawsuit if the town can produce Muhammad, because in the story, Muhammad is the one figure in the world who has managed to be beyond ridicule. Everyone wants what he has. The plot is, at heart, a comment on how censorship works. The only figure nobody can criticize becomes the most valuable figure in the world. In 200, Muhammad is not shown directly. He is put in the back of a moving truck. He is hidden inside a bear costume at one point. His image never actually appears on screen. The show walks right up to the line without crossing it. The episode ends on a cliffhanger. The second part was scheduled for the following week. Within days of 200 airing, a website run by a small group called Revolution Muslim, based in New York City, posted a warning to Parker and Stone. The warning was written by a member of the group named Zachary Chesser, who was using the name Abu Talha al-Amriki at the time. The post named Parker and Stone directly. It said that what they were doing was stupid and that they would probably end up like Theo van Gogh, the filmmaker who had been murdered in Amsterdam. It included a photograph of Van Gogh's body. It linked to the home address of Parker and Stone's production offices in California and to Comedy Central's offices in New York City. Chesser publicly insisted that the post was not a threat, but only a warning. Law enforcement, reading the post, understood it differently. The New York Police Department increased security at the Comedy Central headquarters in direct response. This was not the work of a major terrorist organization. Revolution Muslim was a very small group, no more than a handful of people, operating mostly online. Law enforcement later described the group itself as mostly talk. But the concern from authorities was not about Revolution Muslim directly. It was about what the post might inspire someone else to do. Publicly posting the addresses of potential targets, along with a photograph of a man who had been murdered, was exactly the kind of signal that had, in other cases, been followed by real violence from people who had no connection to the original post. Parker and Stone finished the second part of the 200th episode story, titled 201, in the normal 6-day production schedule. They sent it to the network on the night before it was scheduled to air, on April 21st, 2010. In the version they delivered, there were specific choices they had made about how Muhammad would appear. A black bar with the word censored written on it was placed over his image, as a joke about the network's own past censorship. His name could still be said out loud, and at the end of the episode, Kyle, Jesus, and Santa Claus each gave short speeches about fear and about how giving in to threats always makes things worse. The speeches were the real point of the episode. They were the argument Parker and Stone had been waiting a decade to make. Comedy Central looked at the episode in the final hours before broadcast and made a different decision from the one the creators had made. The network added more censorship. All spoken uses of the name Muhammad were replaced with audio bleeps. All 3 of the closing speeches were covered over with audio bleeps. Not edited for offensive content, bleeped entirely, so that the viewer could tell someone was talking but could not hear a single word of what was being said. Parker and Stone were not told beforehand that this was happening. They found out only when the episode aired. The version that went to broadcast was, from the creator's perspective, a self-betrayal by their own network. The show had spent 22 minutes arguing that fear-based censorship was the real problem in the world, and the network had responded by censoring the argument itself. The morning after the broadcast, Parker and Stone released a public statement saying that Comedy Central had added the extra bleeps without their permission and had removed the lessons of the episode. The public reaction reaction to the whole incident was large. A Zogby poll conducted shortly afterward found that 71% of Americans disagreed with the decision to censor 201. Only 19% agreed with it. Journalists across the political spectrum criticized the network. A columnist for the Washington Post wrote that the terrorists had won because a very small group had managed to make a major American company change its own content out of fear. Comedy Central, after the broadcast, quietly pulled more than just 201 from its catalog. They pulled 200 as well. They pulled Super Best Friends, the season 5 episode that had shown Muhammad without incident 9 years earlier. They pulled both parts of Cartoon Wars, all 5 episodes. Every episode in the show's history that had ever featured Muhammad in any form were removed from the official South Park website, from streaming services, from reruns, and from international broadcast. In the DVD and Blu-ray releases of season 14, the episodes 200 and 201 appear, but they are the censored versions with the bleeps preserved. The uncensored version of 201 has never been officially released. It only exists because, in January of 2014, someone pulled the uncensored file from the South Park website's own servers and posted it online without permission. The bigger international fallout was separate from Revolution Muslim. The government of Sri Lanka, reacting to a moment in the episode where Buddha was shown snorting cocaine, banned the entire series from the country. It is one of only a few places in the world where the show cannot legally be shown at all. Zachary Chesser, the man who had written the original warning post, was arrested later that year for unrelated attempts to support terrorist organizations overseas. He was sentenced in 2011 to 25 years in federal prison. One of the charges he was sentenced for was the communication of threats related to the South Park posts. He remains in prison at the time this episode was made. Parker and Stone in the years since have almost never spoken about the details of the episode. On the DVD commentary for 201, Parker begins talking about the opening scene and then stops. He notes out loud that he has been advised not to talk about the episode. Matt Stone agrees. They spend the rest of the commentary track avoiding direct discussion of what happened. A full commentary for the most controversial episode they have ever produced does not exist. This is where season 14 sits in the history of the show. It is the moment where, for the first time, the people making South Park could not be protected by the normal rules of how television works. A threat from a small group online had been enough to make a major American company censor its own show, pull multiple episodes from circulation, and increase physical security at its offices. And the creators of the show, who had spent 14 years pushing every limit they could find, discovered that the one limit they could not push was a limit that had nothing to do with the network, with the audience, with the critics, or with decency. It had to do with people who had proven, in other cases, that they would kill over a drawing. That limit stayed in place. It is still in place today. All 5 of those episodes remain unavailable through legal streaming channels. The show has never tried again. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. After that season, Parker and Stone pulled back in some ways. They spent the next decade making episodes that went after politicians, celebrities, technology companies, and almost every available target they could find. But they stopped going after Muhammad. The topic effectively became closed. And then, in 2025, after a quiet couple of years and a shift in who actually owned the network itself, they found themselves in a completely different kind of fight. Not with extremists this time, not with religion, with their own parent company, with the President of the United States, and with a corporate deal that had just given them $1.5 billion. What they did with that money, within hours of signing for it, and what they aired on Comedy Central that same night, is where this ends. Section 10. The $1.5 billion middle finger. By the middle of 2025, South Park had been off the air for a long time. Season 26 had ended in March of 2023. The show had not produced a new traditional episode in more than 2 years. The reasons were messy. Parker and Stone were producing other projects. They were working on a Broadway musical. They had made a couple of one-off streaming specials for Paramount Plus, but a real new season with a full run of weekly episodes kept getting pushed back. The deeper reason for the delay had to do with money and ownership. Comedy Central, the network that has aired South Park since 1997, is owned by a company called Paramount. Paramount, in 2025, was in the middle of a merger with another company called Skydance, run by the son of a billionaire who happened to be a close political ally of Donald Trump. The merger was complicated. It required approval from the American government's broadcasting regulator. The regulator was controlled at that moment by people appointed by Trump, and the company trying to get its merger approved, Paramount, Paramount was also being sued personally by Trump. Trump had filed a lawsuit against a news program on CBS, which Paramount also owns. The show was called 60 Minutes. Trump claimed the program had edited a news interview in a way that made a political opponent of his look better than she actually was. Most legal analysts who looked at the case described it as almost impossible for Trump to win in a normal court, but Paramount, which needed the merger approved, did not take it to a normal court. In July of 2025, Paramount settled the lawsuit. They paid Trump $16 million. A few weeks after the settlement was announced, Paramount made another decision that made headlines. They canceled The Late Show with Stephen Colbert, a long-running late-night program on CBS hosted by one of the most publicly critical voices on the American left toward Trump personally. Paramount said the cancellation was about money. Many observers, including several members of the United States Congress, said publicly that they believe the cancellation was part of the same pattern. A company trying to get a merger approved was quietly making moves to avoid angering the person whose appointees controlled the approval. While all of this was happening in public, Parker and Stone were negotiating a new contract with Paramount in private. The contract would cover the next several years of South Park. It would cover streaming rights, which were about to come up for renewal. It would cover how many new episodes they had to make and over how long. And it was, by any measure, one of the biggest television deals of the year. During the negotiations, something unusual happened. Parker and Stone, frustrated with how the merger was affecting their ability to plan new episodes, went public. They posted a statement on social media in July of 2025 saying that the merger was disrupting their work and that they hoped fans would still get to see the new episodes somehow. A television show's creators openly calling their own merger a disaster while the deal was still being finalized is not a normal thing to do. On July 23, 2025, two things happened on the same day. First, Paramount announced a new deal with Parker and Stone. The deal was worth $1.5 billion. It covered 50 new episodes across 5 seasons, plus the rights to stream all of the show's previous episodes on Paramount+. It was the biggest television deal in the show's entire history. Parker and Stone had gone from 2 college students making paper cartoons in the 1990s to signing the largest animation contract in cable history in less than 30 years. 10 hours after that announcement, the season 27 premiere of South Park aired on Comedy Central. The episode is called Sermon on the Mount. The title is a play on the name Paramount and on a famous religious speech from the Bible. It had been written during the exact period when the merger fight was happening and the lawsuit was being settled. And across its 22-minute runtime, Parker and Stone used the premiere of their biggest ever season to publicly attack the company that had just paid them $1.5 billion, and the man that company had just paid $16 million to. Here is how the episode works. Donald Trump is shown as a major character, not as a cartoon version of himself, drawn in the usual South Park style. The show chose for this season to put the real photograph of Trump's face onto a small cartoon body. Every time he appears, you see his actual face, taken from real photos, cut and pasted onto an animated body. The effect is jarring in a way the normal cartoon style is not. The show was not willing to let the audience pretend they were watching a parody. The actual man was the target. In the episode, Trump sues the town of South Park for $5 billion after the townspeople object to a religious figure being placed inside the local elementary school. The figure is Jesus. Jesus has been put in the school by order of the Trump administration. When the townspeople complain, Jesus pulls them aside and, in a hushed voice, tells them that he does not actually want to be in the school, but he has to be, because his presence is part of a legal settlement with Paramount. He warns the residents not to fight it. He points directly to what happened to CBS. He asks them whether they want to end up like Colbert. It is as clear a statement about the real legal situation the show's parent company was in as any cartoon has ever made about its own network. The episode mocks the 60 Minutes settlement directly. It shows a version of the 60 Minutes program with its real-life hosts nervously praising Trump on air because they know he is watching. The satire is extremely close to the real pattern of events. American news programs that have, in the recent past, changed how they cover Trump out of fear of legal action. The cartoon is holding up a mirror to its own network and showing it to the audience. There is also a running joke involving Trump's body. The episode shows him fully undressed in a desert and uses real photographs and computer-generated imagery to create a version of Trump walking naked through the sand. Paramount asked Parker and Stone before the episode aired to blur the depiction of Trump's private parts. Parker and Stone refused. They argued back and forth with Paramount for 4 full days about it. In the end, they compromised in a specific way. They drew 2 too small eyes on the body part. Having eyes drawn on it, according to their argument, made it a character, not a private part. Characters do not need to be blurred on television. Paramount, after 4 days of fighting, agreed. The White House released an official statement the day after the episode aired. The statement accused the show of being irrelevant, of hanging on by a thread, and of being a fourth-rate production. The president's press secretary, Taylor Rogers, wrote that no cartoon could derail Trump's successful record as president. This is, on its own, a fact worth stopping on for a second. A cartoon episode of a cable show was, in July of 2025, significant enough that the White House issued a formal condemnation of it within 24 hours. Trump himself, according to reporting at the time, was furious. He did not sue the show. That is the part that almost does not make sense. The show had just used him, his face, his body, and his private legal history in a way that he has previously sued over for much smaller things, and he did not sue. The most likely reason, which several legal reporters have pointed to, is that suing the show would require Trump to engage publicly with exactly the accusations the show was making. It would require him to discuss his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein, which the episode also references. It would require him to discuss the 60-minute settlement. Suing would confirm in legal filings that the show's satire was landing on real targets. Sherry Redstone, the woman who controlled Paramount through her family's company, personally approved the episode without having watched it. Her executives reviewed it. They told her what was in it. She trusted their judgment. She signed off. The woman who owned the company that the episode was attacking approved the attack on her own company. The episode was watched by roughly 430,000 people during its original broadcast on Comedy Central. That number is modest by television standards. What made the episode a cultural event was everything that happened afterward. Clips from it spread across social media in the hours after airing. It reached #1 on Paramount Plus. The combined audience across cable, streaming, and social sharing made it, by Paramount's own internal measurements, the most watched single episode of the show in more than 25 years. Parker, when asked about the episode at a fan convention the following day, responded with a single sentence and a long, silent stare at the camera. He said that he and Matt were terribly sorry. Then he said nothing. He and Stone sat there for several seconds, not moving. The silence was the answer. This is where the secret of season 27 lives. Parker and Stone, on the same day that they signed the biggest television deal of their careers, with a company that was in open political negotiation with a sitting president, used their first new episode to attack that company, attack that president, and use the contract itself as cover to say things that almost no other production on American television could say. They did it knowing that suing them would only make things worse for everyone involved. They did it knowing that the corporate parent had already shown, with CBS and with Colbert, that it would bow to political pressure. And they did it on air, in public, in the exact first 22 minutes of content Paramount had just paid them $1.5 billion to produce. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.